Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast. I'm your host, Pascal-Emmanuel Gobry, the publisher of Sphere Media. And with me is Wilfred Reilly, who is a political scientist, an academic, but most importantly, because it's the most important thing in life, a Twitter personality.
Mm,
Um, I that's how I found out about you. I think we've been following each other on X for some time now. I think your content is very interesting, and you manage to find the right balance between sort of being political and just being like common sense.
okay.
Because a lot of people on Twitter, myself included, are basically political ideologues, which is fine. You do need ideologues, but that's not who you are. Um, so we're going to talk about your books, but first, is does that portrait agree with you?
Yeah, I'd say that's roughly correct. I mean, when it comes to politics in general, I mean, I've had a number of leadership roles. Just a typical one. I was the ombudsman for Kentucky State for a while until a year or two ago. I've run for local office and that sort of thing. And I tend to be pretty pragmatic about what actually works. So, I mean,
Right.
I think that a lot of people have very well outlined ideological theories in their mind in those sort of debate spaces like Twitter or Reddit, whether that's monarchism or communism or fascism or something like that. And I think just looking at that from the perspective of business or political science, there's often the question of, would that actually work? Would that accomplish anything? So my question generally is, how effective would your ideas be in practice? And mine are often somewhat incremental as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Uh, God, I hate when people ask me that question, so I'm kind of afraid of
Okay.
asking you. And so if you don't want to answer it, just say I don't have anything interesting to say. But I do want to ask about your Twitter style. Like, do you think about how you communicate on X? Do you think about like the way you phrase things, um, the way you interact with people, or is it just off the cuff? Because like for many many years now, people have asked me about my social media strategy, and my answer is always like I don't have one. Like it's literally just like brain dump from my brain to my phone, and apparently tens of thousands of people like it, but there's no strategy.
Yeah, it's very similar. I say what I think, and I mean I think I have a brand to some extent. I mean, witty or would be witty guy with a range of professional experiences who's good with numbers or something. But I mean, I also comment on dating. I
That's
talk
true.
about. Yeah, and I think again there the goal is sort of commonsensical. I mean, I remember that Manosphere versus feminist Twitter had a huge fight about a month and a half ago about these sort of questions, like is it abusive to expect your female partner to sleep with you? Most of the time, of course. Or is it abusive to expect your male partner to have a job? And
Right.
there's an interesting philosophical question there, but the answer is of course not. I mean, no one's going to date a member of those representative groups that doesn't do those things. So
Right.
that's kind of the presentation. But no, I basically just say things that I think are interesting, and to some extent within brand, but really just things that I think are interesting overall. And I think, by the way, if I were going to give young influencer types, especially guys on the right, some advice, it would actually be to do that. If you look at anything from basketball to European or American football to debate, there's now this whole polishing process that begins when people are 11 or 12 that actually
Right.
I think makes people pretty unrecognizable and artificial unless they're one of the very best.
Right.
So you often would stand out much more if you just grew up independently
Right.
reading, everything from Kipling to Marx and then started saying
Right.
what you thought.
Right. Here, here. All right. So let's talk about your books. So hey, let's start with Hate Crime Hoax because I thought it was very interesting. I spent quite some time before I even realized you wrote that book. Like
Okay.
people would like post about some horrible hate crime, and I would just post a picture of the cover as a reply and like not say anything else. Like when you have these absurd things,
That's
like
really funny.
like sometimes you can just tell, right? You don't even have to like look past the headline. It's like, oh, MAGA thugs, beat up black guy in Manhattan. It's like, no, that didn't happen.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct.
So can you give an outline of well, first of all, how did you notice this? What made you think, even before writing the book, what made you think, oh, like this happens a lot? Like, oh, everybody assumes there's some hoaxes, but like it turns out it happens a lot. And so what was the thing that got you to think, oh, there's something there?
Well, I mean, I think for me, the kind of villain origin story that I've given a couple times talking about this particular book is that in Chicago, I was a grad student. I was a member of the grad student community. This is maybe 2011, 2012. And around that time, there were a number of these very widely reported hate incidents in the city and around it. There were actually four or five. Now, when I think back, when people have reminded me of this, but there were three that really stuck in my
Yeah.
mind. One was a University of Chicago student named Derek Cockaline, and this is at the end of this time period, but who claimed that an entire group of conservative hackers, which he called the U Chicago Electronic Army, were chasing him around and sending him messages and threatening him with anal rape. They were going to
Oh my
kidnap his
god.
girlfriend, just all this crazy stuff. So this ran in the Tribune. I think the Journal in New York picked it up. It was just a big city sort of crazy story. Hacker groups after this man. There was another one where a bar called Velvet Rope Ultra Lounge burnt to the ground. And this is a very kind of trendy little club style place in the west suburbs of Chicago. I've actually
Okay.
been to the bar a couple times, as I recall. But these horrific anti-gay slurs, "kill the faggots," excuse me, and so on, were written all over the walls. And again, so this is a major story. You can still find both of these stories just in any newspaper archive.
By the way,
And
you
there were
can
a
say
couple.
hi to my co-host.
Oh yeah,
I told you this is a low production values
look at
podcast.
that
So
boost.
my wife isn't here to take care of the dog, so the dog's here, and
That's cool.
she likes me very much, doesn't she? Allez, coucher,
I
coucher.
like Degs, but
What?
I said I like Degs, a line
Yeah,
from the movie Snatch. So I mean, yeah, that's a welcome co-host. But no, I mean, so there was another one of these incidents, getting into some of the more obscure ones, but at Michigan Tech, which is a few hundred miles away, but an engineering school that feeds into Groupon, some of the Chicago tech companies. A guy allegedly threatened to shoot everyone on campus, just a crazy crime. Like, I'm going to go outside and shoot every black person on campus. And I was looking at these stories with the morning paper, coffee, and every one of them fell apart. And they fell
right.
apart in hilarious ways. I mean, the club owner, Velvet Rope, turned out to have burnt down his own bar because he owed a lot of people money, which is not necessarily the thing to do in the Chicago nightlife business. So he needed an insurance settlement. He apparently set the place on fire. He painted all of the slurs himself. This came out later when he got into all kinds of other trouble. He was arrested for a DUI in another state. Women, his friends snitched on him. I think he was caught with some drugs. So in the insurance press, this became a story about like we need to watch these young businessmen that are capable of
Yeah.
saying anything. But that was the first of the stories. The Derek Cockaline case turned out to be completely fake as well. The FBI actually got involved, and what they found was that because of how IP addresses and MAC addresses work, which I suspect you know, the kid had just been messaging himself from different computers and different Facebook accounts and saying this crazy stuff. And by this point, I think people were starting to kind of chuckle about this in the grad school scene. But I mean, all of them, Michigan Tech, that one was extremely Machiavellian, a fraternity rival or something like that of this particular kid. And
Right. Right.
he had sent out a message on a messaging app called Yik Yak, which is a lot like Twitter, saying, I'm going to shoot everyone I see tomorrow a smile, because apparently there'd been some fighting between white and black men on the campus, and he was saying, we're engineering students, let's clear this up. But a friend, or not a friend, a rival took this image, cut and pasted it so it just said, I'm going to shoot all of the black people, and turned this into the campus security office. And so, I mean,
Oh
I would
my
assume this guy's
god.
door was kicked in by the local sheriff at the least, but he was taken to jail, and his family was outraged. I mean, they went to bat to clear his name. He survived the whole thing, got a job in engineering, but that was it. Like, all of these things were fakes. And kind of getting to the point, looking at this, and I later compiled a pretty good sized data set of incidents that I was keeping track of, and about 2/3 of those turned out to be fakes. So, like, as I progressed forward, one of my ideas was, if I get an academic job and I have a summer off or I get a sabbatical, this is something I'd like to write a book on. How often does this happen? Not a quant estimate of what percentage of all hate crimes are
Right.
hoaxes, but just how many of these hoaxes are there? And the number's in the over 1,000 in the data set I have right now.
Wow. Yeah. Do you have you looked at like trends in the data set? Like, is there a particular kind that stands out?
Well, yeah, actually, which is kind of interesting. We find first of all that, or I find first of all that a huge number of these hate crimes or these hate hoaxes are concentrated on college campuses. That was the
Okay.
most striking thing. That if you look
Okay.
at college, university, prep school campuses, that was about two
Interesting. Yeah.
thirds of the total hoax incidents, and it was 1% of the population. So we are kind of creating these hothouse environments where people can just
Right.
say, I am a
Right.
victim. You can't
Right.
challenge that. There were differences in group perpetration of these hoaxes. Blacks were a bit ahead of whites. But the group that really stood out were actually Muslim or Arab Americans, who were a very small group, but
Oh,
were
interesting.
overrepresented, something like 10 to 1. I mean, one of the most famous hoaxes in the book, Yasmin Saweed, the white men tried to tear my hijab off and abuse
Oh,
me.
right.
That was a Muslim American hoax. So there were some interesting patterns in the data. Yeah, actually.
That's that. Well, as a Frenchman, I will note that I have a memory. I have to figure out how to say this because I believe it was off the record, but I was invited to a thing
Okay.
where a kind of roundtable between representatives of like the populist right and sort of Muslim European activists. And
Okay.
this lady very seriously said, I've been a victim of over 100 hate crimes.
Hmm.
Just like, what?
Well, one of the things that, if I could jump in there very
Like,
briefly, I mean,
you,
first of all, that's crazy.
lady, you would not be alive. Like,
Well, it all depends what you mean. I mean, so I've had feminist friends say that about sexual assault. And I don't mean to
right,
be crude at all here, but when I ask them what they mean, they say, well, you know, during sex, people don't all, or oral sex, people don't always tell me when they're about to have an orgasm. So technically, I can't consent to that. And I mean, if I point out that women are much worse about that, they'll say, well, then you're a victim of sexual
thank you
assault.
for
Like,
keeping it PG-13, by the way.
yeah, but I mean, but it was all that sort of thing. Like, I worked as a waitress,
Right,
and
right, right,
every third patron would lightly slap me on the ass, and I'd turn around and whack him on the head, and that's not
right,
just social rudeness, that's sexual assault. And I think if you were to take the most extreme definition of anything without mocking real sexual assault or hate
right,
crime,
right, right.
you'd kind of find this. Like, I mean, you go to the dojo, you're physically assaulted 50 times. Like, after I tapped out, he held the choke for 3 seconds. And normal people just don't talk that way, but activists
Right,
do.
right, 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 right. That's interesting. That's interesting. So my internal bet on the most fake hate crimes would have been homophobic hate crimes because there's this myth of like the bunch of like frat guys who like beat up a gay guy, and
Hmm.
like I'm pretty sure that it's 100% fake. Like the most famous one is Matthew Shepard, which is
Oh, yeah.
famously not. I mean, he died, poor guy, but it was like a drug deal gone wrong, and the guys didn't even know he was gay. Um, but I guess it's Muslims.
Yeah, the thing is, there are a lot of fake hate crimes, and I don't want to be cynical about this, but there are a lot of fake hate crimes in each of these areas, so it can be a close race sometimes. But yeah, Muslim Americans were in the lead there, and I also think there's a distinction between kind of like crime tends to be really stupid and mundane.
Right.
Like cops will use the term
Yes.
misdemeanor homicide to describe violence in black or sometimes poor white neighborhoods. Like, what happened? Well, he stepped on
Right.
my shoe. So what did you do? Well,
So
I
I
shot
shot him.
him
Yeah.
32 times with the Glock with the switch. So at a lower level, it's even more than that. Like someone slaps you because they think you're gay, and so you're going to be soft as a man. Stuff like
Right.
that probably happens as reported. What I found was that virtually none of the really high profile theater kid sort of hate offenses that were
Right.
reported
Right.
turned out to be real. Like the two men that followed Jussie Smollett, this is the classic example, through a
Right.
upper
Yes.
class Chicago neighborhood full of junior executives wearing MAGA hats and patriotic
In
ski masks.
Chicago at 2 a.m., just
Yeah,
hanging out in
none of
Chicago
that's
at
ever
2
real.
a.m. on the street. All right. Well, thank you. That was very interesting. All right, let's talk about the one you've got up there, which is Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me.
Okay.
I'm very interested in this one because I grew up in France where first of all, we have a centralized system, so the curricula are set by the Ministry of Education for the entire
Yeah.
country. um and they're literal communists, like literally they're communists, the people who do these things. And so the going to school, particularly in history in France, is you get brainwashed. And I grew up in a conservative household, so I basically, like, every time I went home, I had to go through like the de-brainwashing session with my parents.
That's funny. Yeah.
And I thought this was like a unique French thing, but later on, I learned that it's pretty much the same thing in the US. So, but of course, the specific lies are different because in France, they lie about the French Revolution, right? Um, Nobody died in the French Revolution. It was definitely just the people rising up and not at all,
Yeah.
blah blah blah. So what are the biggest not liberal lies, but lies liberal teachers say to
Well,
average kids?
they're very similar in the United States. I mean, I opened the book with kind of two of the great classics just because we often hear the USA and other Western countries are founded on kind of a double genocide. This would certainly be true in the New World, the annihilation of the peaceful native
Right,
peoples, and then the unique importation of enslaved Africans. So, I
right,
mean, chapter one of the book points out that slavery, and this is a direct counter to formal lessons that are taught in the United States, by the way. I mean, I think you saw this on Twitter the other day, but 41% of
right.
Americans believe that only the USA ever had slavery. More people
Yeah,
believe that, I don't want to get the figures wrong here, but it's well over a third of young white women and an astonishing 2/3 of young black women think that white people invented slavery. So they don't really separate the Americans from the French there, but they think that it
right,
was the white man entered it. Let's sort of Bambi run its man. The white man entered a peaceful bucolic world full of
right.
people sitting around
Noble
eating
savages living in
plantains.
harmony with nature, and then white people invented slavery.
Yeah, that's they formally taught in many countries. Anyway, so I open with the slavery chapter. I just make the obvious point. I think I read most of the best research published on this subject. And I mean, slavery goes back to a point in time when humans stopped simply killing and eating their
Yes.
enemies. I mean,
Basically, w- as soon as as a people develops the concept of private property, they start putting people in the box private property. Like
yeah,
the only people that don't have slavery don't have the concept of property, and that's why they don't have slavery.
even some of them have slaves. They just call them something else. Like
Right.
the Comanche word would translate to broken. It just means defeated warrior. But so slaves, in fact, were one of the first recognized forms of property. That's something I hadn't known. But I mean, in African traditional law, if you go into West
Right.
Africa, Ashanti, and so on, these are fairly civilized
Right.
places in the sense of
Right.
could pave the roads.
Right.
But I mean, the slavery was an endemic
Right.
institution, and one of the three forms of property recognized was in slaves. So
Right.
you would simply leave someone your slaves, like you would leave them your
Right.
salt or your gold or your weapons. But anyway, slavery goes back way longer than that. Slave, one of the first 5 or 6 written human words. If you go into,
I did
I
not
mean,
know
it's
that.
funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, if you go into Sumerian and Akkadian hieroglyphs, first of all, if you read these hieroglyphic languages, including Chinese, you get an understanding of what humans actually are.
Right.
I mean, like a
Right.
symbol for marriage will be something like the trade of a bag of money for a heart. And I'm not entirely sure that's supposed to represent a heart. It's just like that sort of thing. Danger is, or opportunity is danger plus chance. But
Right.
anyway,
Right.
slave is literally just the word for person from another society, usually in hieroglyphs like man from the
Right.
mountains, with a prefix that means like defeated.
Right.
The slave is a defeated fighter. That's you see the
Right.
genesis of it right there. But anyway, I go from there through the next 2,000 years. I mean, the Roman slave trade, the Arabic slave trade in both blacks
Right.
and whites, where you had these corsairs, including a decent number of blacks, raiding
Yeah.
along the European coast for years like a
Yeah.
plague. And I mean, you had
Yeah.
cities and counties.
Entire coastal areas depopulated.
Yeah,
Um, and white women were particularly sought after. I wonder why.
yeah, no, the Arabs were. Now, one of the things that I've actually heard as a defense of the Arabs is that they weren't racist. Because if you talk about the Arab slave trade, the point is that they did enslave Americans, Frenchmen, blacks, Slavs. So they didn't have a racial bias. If
Yes,
you
but
lost
even
to
that
them,
isn't true, right? Because
well,
like different slaves had different prices,
no,
and
that's
like
right. Yeah.
white slaves were more expensive, white women were the most expensive, and to the point about black slavery. So the Arabs captured a lot of black slaves. Why are there no black people in Iraq or whatever? It's because black males were systematically castrated.
Yeah, well, all fighting men captured by the Arabs were systematically castrated, actually. So if you were a black or a white guy and your boat lost, I mean, like
Yeah,
if you were fighting for Mali or you were fighting for Genoa would be one of the Caucasian city states in the sense of white as we think of it, and you were fighting the Turk,
yeah,
and you were defeated, what would probably happen is that they would cut your cock off and you would devote the rest of your life to improving the agricultural and rowing endeavors of the caliphate. So
yes,
this is some of the history that I talk about, but the Barbary slave trade, which is exclusively in whites, the Atlantic slave trade, of course, I devote pages to that. Brutal, but I'm almost entirely in blacks. But the point is not that slavery wasn't bad by our terms today. It's that slavery existed throughout history, and if anything,
yes,
the West played a unique role in stopping it. I mean, Britain devoted an entire fleet, albeit a
yeah.
kind of a small, creaky one, but no one else did anything,
Yeah,
to
I mean, they
blockading
put an
slave trading
embargo on
ports.
Brazil. Yeah, and the French did nothing. Well, I mean,
No,
this
they
is
did some
also
things.
an interest of mine because for the same reason, like because of all the lies, and I can go on about this. French slaves in Haiti were allowed to go on strike, which is one of my favorite French facts.
Very, very French.
But this is literally true. They would I mean, it wasn't called a strike, but essentially the slaves would escape, except they would go like a short walk away in the jungle and wait, and then the overseers would come and they would negotiate,
Hmm.
and then they would return. I mean, presumably, there was some, again, it was slavery, not defending it, and so on and so forth, but it's just fascinating to see just the breadth in the history of that institution and the differences within it, like how it was practiced in different places.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
mean, I also think that there's no real need for people that are making kind of coherent center right points to say, well, I'm not defending the practice. I mean, I'm not sure whether ultimate morality exists at all, actually, except for a few Ten Commandments level things humans have managed to agree on. Don't rape tribes, women, don't eat people. But beyond that, I mean, like the idea that you shouldn't take defeated military enemies who've been trying to kill you and make them work, that definitely is not a thing that humans inherently believe. Um, I mean, to some extent, you could argue that we do this today with prisoners and so on down the line. I certainly have no problem with that. So, it's a good thing, most likely, that societies move forward when it comes to slavery. But I, I think the basic point is that obviously, yes, the societies of the past probably were not just constant terror from sunup to dusk.
Right.
Um, and that would
That's an
actually
important point.
be the focus. Yeah, that would be the impression that you would get from reading a lot of writing on the American or European continental left. I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all that in practice, before you had modern automobile transportation or anything like that, if you had isolated plantations full of people that you were making work for you, there'd be a bunch of strategies that you would use to actually make that happen. There also are some pretty vague gradations here, right? Like the alternative to slavery in 1700 wasn't freedom as a
Right.
banker, it was serfdom usually. So
Right.
in Europe, there, Russia or France, you didn't have slaves, you just had peasants that couldn't really leave their land unless they wanted to,
Right.
go to the one city in the country and live to be 22. So the history was brutal in many ways, different from our
Yes.
time, foolish to judge in our moral terms, blah blah blah.
Right. I mean, so in France, France was perhaps the first or one of the earliest, certainly, nations to abolish not just slavery but serfdom.
Mhm.
And so at the time when France was engaged in the slave trade and had slave colonies in places like Haiti, uh, French peasants were not serfs. What they did do, however, was starve.
Oh yeah,
And like again, not not saying blah blah blah, but like Haitian slaves or slaves in the Caribbean did not starve because when you're in a tropical climate, there's always stuff growing on the trees. And so you can eat more or less well, but you don't starve to death. Until the invention of canning at the end of the 18th century, French peasants would sometimes starve to death. That's a thing that they did and that Haitian slaves didn't do.
yeah, and
Um,
I
and
think that
so it's like,
people, almost any up middle class citizen, is going to be kind of reluctant to draw the obvious conclusion from that. But yeah, I think if you insist on comparing people in the past, it would certainly be accurate to say that some people who were slaves or battle captives had hard lives, but less horrible ones than some people who weren't. I mean,
right.
it's very obvious that being a peasant or being a serf, and Russia and many other countries certainly did continue serfdom until almost the modern era, that's
Yes.
not an inherently dramatically better state than being a slave.
Right.
So, I mean, there are actually quite a few studies of this. Have you read Time on the Cross?
No, I have not. What's
Time
that?
on Time on the Cross is a it's this book took a lot of heat, mostly from black activists, although it was written by very liberal people. But it was an attempt to take a quantitative look at black American slavery. And what the authors said was, well, by our standards today, black American slavery was horrible, but it seems to have been roughly as horrible as most of the other options for people at the same class level or a little above it at that time. So they actually compared the life expectancy of black slaves to that of, what do they pick? Dock workers in England, Appalachian poor
Oh,
whites,
fascinating.
like all of these other people, like people in central London at this time. And the slaves
That's
were in the middle of the
fascinating.
pack. Like they didn't have great lives. I don't know why I keep repeating that, but all these other people didn't either. Like almost every condition of that time, like being a fighting man on a pirate ship, would be unimaginably difficult for the
Right.
average American bureaucrat arguing these topics today.
Right. 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 It's so funny that you say that because it was a very common argument made by Southern defenders of slavery, which is like, oh, your workers are free, but actually, like, they're worse off materially. And when I read that, I always thought, "You're full of shit." And
No,
it
but
turns
it's
out
accurate.
it's kind of true. That's really funny. Okay. What are some other lies? So, I assume there's a bunch of stuff on Native Americans too, which I'm also interested in because I know very little about this stuff. I understand a, mo, maybe not most, but like much of the killing that happened was through disease, which was tragic but unavoidable if you have a new population that arrives in a continent when they don't have the immune system to defend against diseases. But also, like, the Indians were not angels.
Yeah, no, I mean that's chapter. I mean that's chapter 3. Actually, we moved one of the chapters on the realities of the Cold War was thought important enough to move up to the start as well. And one sentence
Oh,
there, the,
interesting.
the sort of Dalton Trumbo narrative on the Cold War in the USA and the quote unquote Red Scare, that Americans and to some extent Brits just began panicking about communism with no evidence
Right.
and locking up innocent liberals. No, I
Right.
mean, like the USA
Yeah,
with
no, they
actually
were
a very,
communists. Yeah.
yeah, but like with some help from European NATO allies, as I recall. I mean, the USA has had decoded Venona cables for a while. Like we
Yes.
know who the Russian agents were during World War II and the 10 years after. And most of the people that were accused in these kind of cause celeb trials, like Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, of being Russian spies, were Russian spies. I
Yes.
mean, we've known that for
Right.
decades
The
now.
Rosenbergs. Yes. 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 Yes.
But so that's chapter 2. But the Native Americans thing, yeah, the one of the points of the book is kind of what I just said, but with a little less wind. And I guess if you broke it down more simply, ultimate morals may or may not exist, but humans certainly have not had shared moral systems across time. Very few people historically behaved in ways that we would approve of today. By the way, they'd be horrified by nuclear weapons and factory
Right.
farming and
Right.
OnlyFans prostitution, where 1 in 20 women is technically a hooker, and this sort of thing. I mean, imagine a nobleman in any society thinking about this. The
Oh
young
yeah.
daughters in your family are especially in demand, and so on. But anyway, so you have to kind of avoid presentism while actually looking at the rates of measurable behaviors across society. And by that standard, I mean, no, the Native Americans were not peaceful angels in harmony with the environment. The natives were some of the greatest warrior people in history once they got horses. And so I just talk about that through the chapter, that Native American history prior to the arrival of whites was one of pretty constant tribal conflict. There's a great article that just ran in American Archaeology that makes the point the most violent era in U.S. history was before Europeans arrived. And that's because the Anasazi, one of the really almost Aztec level advanced peoples in our Southwest, built up to the point of having sizable cities and desertifying entire regions. And then they basically were conquered as the resources they used began to collapse, as population density began to collapse. They were overrun. Everybody died. So the article says things like, cities that had a population of 40,000 in year X. Yeah, I don't think I'm overstating that. It was 40,000. It wasn't 4,000, but had a population of 0 in year Y. And they described the number of people
Fascinating.
that had battle trauma on their hands, their heads, and
Right.
so on.
Right. Right.
And I go from there to actually discussing the wars between the whites and natives, which sometimes were mutually genocidal and sometimes weren't. I mean, 1.5% of America is Native American now. I talk about the role of disease. And again, there's that point of you can't just oversimplify this as the bad people came and attacked the good people.
Right.
In fact, the natives in most cases probably were the worst people if you're going to use a modern Geneva Convention sort of
Oh,
standard.
for sure.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we forget that now, where you'll watch things like Dances with the German Shepherds, the sort of American content on Native American Indians, and it really is like these cruel, hairy savages came from across the plains and taught them the words for rape and murder.
Yeah.
I mean, if you actually read accounts of the people who fought the Comanche or the Iroquois,
Yeah.
I mean, these people
They
were
were
very,
not kind to prisoners, for example.
yeah, they were very skilled torturers. I mean, they would do things like tie people out over ant hills. And
Yeah.
I think some of this had to do with the lack of entertainment. I mean, it was sort of something
If
to
only
do
they'd
at
had
night.
TikTok.
Well, they didn't really have much of anything to do. There was sex, training, and
Yeah.
entertainments of various kinds, and that was one of them. People tend not to like their enemies.
Yeah.
So this is something that's actually been commented on in different tribal societies up until
Yes.
almost the modern era. I mean, like Kipling's line, "When you're wounded and lost on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come out to cut up what remains, they roll to your rifle and blow out your brains." But that's something that many people have said, fighting warrior clan level groups for 1,000 years, and that was the experience of someone trying to build a family in, say, Kansas or
Right.
Texas, where you had the Comanche and the other great tribes, the Sioux, Kiowa, and so on.
Yep. Yep. Uh, good. Good. Okay. So what's give me? Um, I mean, I'm interested in knowing what they are, but what the lies are, and like having the list. But I'm also interested in like what's the biggest, what's the most impactful, like what's the. I mean, I assume slavery, but like you know, um, how I guess another way of phrasing the question would be uh what percentage of the like K-12 curriculum is sort of like, prop race propaganda or anti-American propaganda versus stuff that's just history, or maybe just left-leaning history, but not stuff that's like, oh, America is evil. You know what I mean? Like, is
Yeah,
there do you have an answer to that question?
I do know what you mean. I don't think that the worst kind of propaganda is more than 20 or 30% of it, but that's a lot because
Right.
it sort of sets direction. I mean, when you get out of an American, or I'd assume modern European school,
Yeah.
your starting point of view is that your society is bad, not that it was
Yes.
good. Like,
Yes.
we've done some great things, but we conquered heaven, would be kind of a standard opinion that someone might reach based on what they were taught.
Right.
And I have a real problem with this because it's all bullshit. I
Right.
mean, so the propaganda is pretty heavily layered. It's not the majority of the content, but in terms of the other question, each of the lies in the book tries to reflect that. So I mean,
Yeah.
one of them is white flight wasn't a thing that just happened unprovokedly because of racism. White flight
Wait, they
primarily
talk about
happened in,
white flight and history in schools?
yeah, we talk about it.
That's amazing. Okay.
Modern,
Well,
actually, there's an important point here. Modern American history classes tend to be very backloaded. So, I mean, when I ask my students about historical figures, almost none of them know who Henry Ford was or who the Wright brothers were. Or for that
wow.
matter, if you want to talk about black people, who, Sheriff Bass was or something like that, most of them could get Harriet Tubman. But they know a lot about Malcolm, Martin, both of the Kennedys, this kind of thing. So there's actually a lot of
Yeah.
discussion of Vietnam. There's a lot of discussion of the civil rights movement, the things that really inspired kind of
Very
the
boomer.
boomers.
It's very boomer centric. It's like
It's boomer revision of the curriculum.
that's crazy. Oh man. At least in France they try to sort of equally go from like Mesopotamia to today. So what they say in the process is bullshit, but they don't pretend that history began in 1945 at least.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and it's yeah. I would say the Europeans have a somewhat better history curriculum than the United States does. Definitely, that's one of America's weaknesses. I mean, bear in mind the country's only 200 years old, also. So
Yes.
the people have many noble and glorious histories, and we all fought each other and came here and so on. But 1776 is when the USA actually began. So there's a shorter period to condense in there, and it's definitely been kind of boomer chopped at the end. But yeah, I mean, so white flight was a response in very large part to, I mean, crime surged about 500%, 800% for blacks between 1963 and 93 are the years I usually use. This, by the way, is kind of the great thing in American society that's just never mentioned. One of
Yes.
the points that I make is that this can't be trackable to racism. Crime surged for whites almost as much, and racism was declining against blacks this entire period. It's
Yes.
also almost impossible to track this to genetics. You saw an 800% increase among the same population.
Right.
So the question is, what actually caused it? And the answer is just absurd social policies like pay per child welfare that it is almost forbidden to discuss in our polite society.
Yes.
So, because this is the gigantic elephant that is untouchable in almost every room, we keep making, and I see other countries do this too, but I think the USA is the worst on this. We keep making the same mistakes over and over. Like the George Floyd campaign, why don't we defund the police and give urban areas more welfare? We tried that. And I mean, we saw after George Floyd's death, the same thing happen that we saw
Yeah,
happen
it
in
was exactly the same
1963.
thing.
It was, yeah.
Uh,
Murder reached back over 20,000 per year. It was an identical process. Yeah.
all right. So I understand you have to run to a class pretty soon. So we have a traditional last question that we ask to all our guests. It's a very long and established tradition from 3 weeks ago,
Okay, fair enough.
which is recommend a book that's not in your area of expertise. Can be any book, just not what's in your area of expertise.
Recommend a book that's not in my area of expertise. Oh, actually, yeah. A book that I'd recommend is The Case for Marriage. This is not at all in the quant political science zone. This is written by a two female academics. One was a feminist, one was a Christian, but in about 2006. And
Oh
they
wow!
respond to most of the claims that were made by kind of third and fourth wave feminism about families being, traps full of incest and perversion and abusive fathers. And they say, well, statistically, that's not true at all. Like men are, in fact, as the old stereotype goes, quite protective. You're
Right.
much safer as a wife than living with a live-in boyfriend or something like that. Men actually have slightly more sex in marriages. I thought it was funny that it was slightly more. Like the women seem to have measured to some extent, kind of know what the cutoff is for you not to
I
divorce.
think now it's much more like Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia, has studied this, and it's like like being married is good if all you want to do is have.
Yeah. Well, I think that first of all, like it's good that people truly love their lovers. I mean, there's also women
Yes.
tend to be wittier and more amoral than men, so you have to wonder if whether some of that is a response to the open dating market that now exists in pornography
Right.
and so on. Like, well, I still want to get married. We've got to. I guess I might be returning to domesticity a bit, but if men and women are keeping each other happy in the bedroom, even more so, and they're both men are cooking now as well, and both people often have jobs. Good. I mean
Yeah,
that I
it's
think
both the frequency of sex and like self-report. Like, are you happy with your sex life? Like married heterosexual couples, like just way higher than anybody else.
Yeah, and I will note that's especially true for women, by the way. Now, for women, a big
Oh,
part of it
interesting.
is how happy your partner is. So that's something for the ladies to perhaps keep in mind. But
Yeah, because
it's,
sex with someone you know is better.
yes. Yeah, well, especially for women. I mean, so
Yes.
like the difference between women's ratings of sex with like a loving husband and women's ratings of sex in like a club bathroom is dramatically just thinking of like nightlife party sort of experiences. Like there women would rate one at an 8, nothing perfect, but very good, and one at a 2. Men would probably rate one at a 9 and one at an 8. So I mean there's very there's less there actually are less
Yeah,
advantages.
men are always going to rate sex at a 9. It's like 9 or 9.5.
It's all
Um,
within the range of 9, maybe.
yeah,
Now, I don't know about that in the modern era, but I think in general, though, all banter aside, like the Case for Marriage is a great book. It makes the point that sexually, financially, again, in terms of what do men do, like marrying a competent man with a regular job like engineer on average increases your income by 300 to 400%
yeah,
as
yeah,
a
yeah.
woman. So I mean, just all of those sort of things. You're not going to be living in the projects or a council estate. Like you and your husband will both be more sexually satisfied. You'll both be in love. All the stock breeding stuff aside. So I mean, that's a good book, and I think it's a book more people should read because it just makes some very obvious
Sounds
points.
good. Yeah. That should be a class, fewer lies from history teacher and more solid life advice that our grandparents used to give, but some for some reason no longer do. All right, I guess I have to release you now.
Well, thanks for appreciate having
This
me
was
on.
listen. This was a lot of fun. We didn't get to go for as long as I wanted to, but this was a lot of fun. I learned a ton. I hope people buy your books
Thank you.
and follow you on X because you're a lot of fun to follow there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.